So in your opinion, how would you best describe or define the core?
Um, I think the core is a the trunk transfers energy. It transfers energy to your limbs, um, and I don't know how to describe it, but essentially almost like a conductor. So it takes in energy and then it um, bounces it back out.
So then how would you, so just to expand on that, how would you describe the function of the core in kind of an athletic context?
Um,
So we can talk about, since you coach rugby players, we can talk more about like a rugby playing athlete.
in general, I just think the core is it's a rigid structure that, when used, um, it's isometric contractions like all the time. It relaxes and contracts, relaxes and contracts. So when you're doing any kind of task, it goes through that repetitive motion. It's not. I don't see the core as something that's very dynamic.
Okay, nice. So then next question, do you currently prescribe any direct and specific core exercises with your athletes?
Yes, now when we're in lockdown, yes, but when we're training generally, so when we're in the gym, no, not really. I will do. I do like doing like human carries. So when we're in combat room, I'll get them do fireman carries, and then I just do different variations of that. So they'll do. They train their core not directly, but by doing exercise that requires them to recruit their core muscles to a
Yep.
higher degree than if they weren't doing that.
More global kind of exercises, not
Yeah.
specifically.
I don't generally don't do. I don't get them to do planks in the gym, side planks, crunches, anything of that nature. I used to, but I just don't think it's a good indicator of our time in the gym. We can spend it up doing other things.
Nice. So just to kind of, so you kind of mentioned there, so without lockdowns, like when you have free reign of your athletes in the gym, you're not really doing it. But in lockdown, you are. So I'll come back to that. So you mentioned you used to do maybe more direct and specific. Can you kind of comment on what changed your mind or kind of what led you to not really implementing those kind of exercises into your programs?
Um, it was a lecture at the NSCA conference by Stu McGill, and um, basically what he's the one that really broke down like how I see the core now. So like for example, the McGill Big Three. It doesn't require a lot of like flexion in the back or anything like that, and he's the one that really got me to think about how the core is actually it's a series of contractions and relaxations, and it's very isometric in nature. So doing exercises that mimic that isometric pattern are a better indicator than doing crunches and things like that. I think crunches are for aesthetics, and that's not the business I'm in.
Nice. So then switching gears to lockdown, obviously you can't train in the same way or the same volume as before. So how have you changed or what have you kind of added for the core training component with these lockdown programs?
So it is a combination of different holds, plank holds, side planks. We'll do again planks in a press position. Um, I'll get them to do things with their feet elevated, but everything is stiff, rigid. Again, and the most I'll do is I'll get them to go into posterior pelvic tilt, and that's the gist of it. So nothing dynamic. If they do dynamic work, it's on their own, but everything is isometric in nature. And
Is it,
then I get them to do partner carries as well if they have someone.
is there any specific reason you don't do the dynamic work over the isometric?
Yeah, I just found like reading and talking to people about it, just the flexion and stuff that it puts on the back. Uh, I just found it was from what I understand of it. And again, I reserve the right to be wrong, but it just doesn't make any sense. And then on top of that too is like you're actually like shortening the psoas, and then that's actually a direct. That's we don't want that when we're trying to run really fast, right? So we want to have loose, pliable hips and not shorten things that are put in a strict range of motion.
Yes. So you just mentioned um, like loads on the back. Can you just explain what you mean by that a little bit more, just so I'm not interpreting?
Yeah, so it'll be is like they'll go into a plank, they'll put some weight again on their hips, so like the glute mid back area, right? They'll put load there and they'll hold those plank positions. I'll get them to do in lockdown. I'll get someone to go on, get your little brother or get someone to put some weight. So I'll push down on that area and hold.
Okay. Yes. That answers it pretty good. So just again, to build off that question, are there any training principles that you kind of have in relation to training the core? So we'll switch it back to when we're not in lockdown. So like the loaded carries and stuff like that. Is there any kind of specific progressions or programming principles you have around those, or
Yeah,
specifically?
so we will just progressively overload our carries. Um, so we'll go, for example, we'll go fireman carry, right? Then we'll go double fireman carry. Then we'll go, fireman carry. I call it with your hair on fire. So basically, they're walking, but that person that's on their shoulder is like squirming, trying to get off, things like that, right? Just those perturbations, I think, are important. And then we'll do that double barrel, same thing. Then we'll do, uh, bear walks or gorilla walks, whatever you want to call them, getting all on all fours. Again, they'll do that with someone on their back. They'll do that with someone moving on their back. They'll do that with someone trying to get off of their back. Um, then we'll go some form of wrestling. So we'll go from our knees, right, which is take the legs out of it. And these are all things that are, again, really challenging your trunk musculature.
Nice. All right. So next question.
Yeah.
Do you believe direct and specific core training will transfer and improve athletic or sports performance?
Yes, all things work. Some things work more than others. So again, if I have someone who's really weak, if we're in a situation, yeah, someone who's really weak, and for my young athletes, I do a purely isometric program, so they don't do anything dynamic. So they'll do split squat iso holds, for example, and hold that. It's the same thing I would do to the trunk. So they'll do the plank, the side plank, and then just to get just a basic level of strength before we can get into other things. And yeah, so I do think it does transfer. And just to what degree as we get older. If you have an athlete who's squatting 2 times their body weight, I just don't think doing core work is gonna benefit them that much greater. That's just my own personal belief.
Yeah.
And again,
So
I reserve the right to be wrong.
So do you think then it has depends on the level of the athlete, the conditioning level of the athlete?
Yep. Everything is all dependent, right? It's so variable. Like I can't say this works, that works. It all depends.
So then just going back to, say, a young or a deconditioned athlete, adding some direct specific core training exercises, do you think there's any athletic abilities that it transfers to best, or is it more just the overall general athleticism development?
I think it's overall general athleticism. I think an athlete with a stronger core will be able to, maybe run faster, jump higher, kick harder, swing a bat harder or faster.
So then again, talking about the young underdeveloped athletes, because you mentioned pretty conditioned athletes probably no use or probably not any added benefit. Do you think those direct and specific core exercises would work better than other more traditional forms of training? So resistance training with barbells or sprint training or jumping to develop those abilities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're really saying in those deconditioned athletes.
Yeah.
Well, the athletes I'm thinking about, the weak ones that I'm thinking about, yes. Just because I've found athletes who have really weak cores have trouble again hitting certain angles from an acceleration standpoint. They can't even resist gravity, right? So that's why they can't lean properly. So yes, I think that is a possibility. Also, too, I've seen you have to have a tremendous amount of core strength to be able to hold top speeds. Okay, just because of the torque coming from essentially you have opposite hand, opposite arm, literally going and it's trying to twist you, but you're resisting it to bring up the other leg. So you again going back to the purpose of the core is to again receive energy and then redirect it. So I do think that requires a high level of stability.
Nice. So now talking about your higher level athletes that maybe they have that 2 times body weight back squatter, doesn't have to be that, but a good base level of strength and fitness. Why do you think those direct and specific exercises might not transfer or further improve their athletic performance?
Because I do think I think to do so direct core work, okay, you have to overload the system, right? But if you're overloading the system with in terms of intensity, the only way to intensify it essentially is to increase duration. And then by increasing duration, again, you're working completely different energy systems and it becomes a greater metabolic effect. And a greater metabolic effect doesn't necessarily translate to pure strength. So, which is why I think they need to go into exercise and positions that are going to overload their musculature in the ways that they would see it on the field of play, right? So, if we're talking rugby, just because that's my example, going into a tackle, okay, it's a hard relax and then contract as they hit, and they're solid like stone when they go into that person. And if they don't have that requisite strength, there's going to be deformation. Deformation isn't good. Okay, it can lead to injuries and things like that. But there's nothing metabolic about that, and it is a very hard maximal contraction. So again, if we're looking at the force velocity curve, right? Essentially, we need it to be strong up here in the maximal side, and they're working more down here on the endurance side.
Yep. Nice. All right, next question. Similar type of question. Do you believe direct core training can decrease the chance of future sports injuries?
Decrease the chance of future sports injuries. Decrease. In young athletes, I think so. I do think so. In older athletes, I think so, maybe not to the same degree. But again, if you do enough core training to the point where it's actually causing detraining and you go into some sporting action and get injured, I think the direct core work could have, again, a negative effect. So I think it's just a matter of how much you do and when you do it. But I just don't think I can't quantify it, so it's hard for me to. I can't think of how to quantify it. That's a better answer.
Hmm.
So I can't say for certain.
Okay, fair enough. So maybe let's talk about the younger athletes. Um, why might you think? How am I going to answer this or ask this question? So, in what ways, I guess, could direct core training prevent injuries in younger athletes?
Again, yeah. So again, their ability to receive energy and redirect it would be greater, just because they're starting from such a low level of core strength. Um,
Mhm.
Basically, how I determine if you have a strong core or not, can you hold a good core? Can you hold a plank for like a minute and a half? That's just my own anecdotal way of looking at it. And I think once you pass that, um, I think it's ceased to have its benefits.
Is it kind of like if they're below a certain capacity or threshold,
Then it
sure
becomes,
they get injured, but then above that base level threshold, other
yeah,
things are at play, maybe?
yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. Everything works, but again, just to that point, what is that point? So if you can't even reach that capacity of my minute and a half plank hold, a minute plank hold, whatever it may be, we're probably better off. We're probably going to prevent some injuries if we kind of get you to that baseline.
Hmm. And that'd be less than the older athletes, just probably because their capacity is a little bit higher.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think
Um,
as you do get stronger, you're able to create more forces, right? So if you the more a weaker athlete can't create the same amount of forces, so their trunk doesn't require them to be utilized to that capacity. But once you start creating more forces, then your trunk needs to be stronger to be able to accept and redirect those forces.
so then, kind of building off that first question, do you believe direct and specific core training works better than traditional forms of training? So, barbell training, sprinting, jumping, for decreasing injury risk.
So, do I think core work does a better job of preventing injuries, or
Than traditional forms of training,
core work? Sorry, direct core works better than traditional training to
prevent
prevent.
injuries.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's the case.
Nice. And then again, just to kind of get more of your thoughts, why do you think that is?
Again, going back to just a certain level of capacity. I like to think of it as a parabola. It works to a point, and then it has diminishing returns by trying to keep you chasing that quality. I think that's what happens. And I just think from a more global standpoint, that's better for it. And also too, it's just like I don't know the stats on this, but what are the trunk injury rates? They're probably not that high in comparison to extremities, like lower limb extremities, arms, elbows, things like that. So
Mhm.
um, global from an injury standpoint, if we're talking global injuries,
Yep.
then it's doing the resistance training work. But if it's spine injuries, maybe I don't know.
Okay.
But again, I don't even think that's the case because it's like axial loading is probably better than just doing trunk loading. So yeah, no. So no, it doesn't work.
Nice. All right. So, in your opinion, does direct or specific core training offer any unique benefits over other forms of training?
Yeah, if you want it to look really good, like doing direct core work, if you want to have a six pack, I think that's where it becomes benefit. I know I've been around a lot of bodybuilders, and they do core work in this way because they're trying to look for a certain aesthetic.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's probably about the only benefit after you reach the capacity to do direct core work.
So basically hypertrophy of the trunk muscles. Other than that, no real unique athletic benefit.
After a certain point, like after that threshold, then yeah.
Okay, perfect. So then so just to build off that, why, in your opinion, might you think so many coaches continue to prescribe direct and specific core exercises in their athletic training programs?
The same reason I did, because I thought there's an added benefit of doing. So carries are considered direct core work or no? Like
In
that's
this context, probably not, just because the limbs are involved so much.
So I just know the coach I talked to are getting away from that, and they're doing just more carries and variations. But like, so we're talking direct, like crunches, planks, side planks. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah. So I guess just to give you some context of how we're kind of viewing it, there's a really big viewpoint in the industry using kind of physio-based exercises. Like that's the research and exercises for low back pain has kind of seeped into sports conditioning. So that's what we're defining as direct and specific. Even though most exercises engage the core somewhat, we're just trying to get a little bit more detail and getting people's opinions on more of those physio-based direct kind of exercises.
Yeah, sorry, just on a side note, the spine's really interesting in the fact that has nothing really to do with like structures, whereas if people are just like feeling healthy and strong, they'll generally have low back pain, and like trying to hit it directly is really hard. But anyways, it's physios. Yeah, so I do think coaches then are doing direct core work because I just think what's happening is people are looking at it from an acute standpoint. They're like, all right, we're trying to fix this injury. And that's kind of what I see in the physio world, where they're treating the injury, but they're not treating like the global pattern. Mm-hmm. Right. And then that's where it's like, yeah, sure, we can fix his low back pain and make him feel good right now. But it's just like, well, when he does all his exercises, is he in the right position? Right. How does he handle load when trying to do that? So it's not just the back. So I think, it's so hard to answer this one. So yeah, I think they do direct core work because they think there's an added benefit. That's all I can say.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, and I know some of these questions probably are difficult to answer, but I think that's why we were interested in doing these interviews, just to get people's deeper thoughts and maybe identify gaps amongst the interviews. Like it seems like there's common questions or common discrepancies between people, and then that's kind of where we can step in and try to flesh out those ideas a bit more. So yeah, there are some difficult questions in here. So next question, you were kind of talking about this, so I'd like to kind of get you to expand on it, but is there ever a situation where directly training the core can have a negative effect? So either on athletic performance or in relation to injury risk, meaning they're more at risk for an injury?
Repeat the question again. I'm just thinking.
So is there ever a situation where direct core training can have a negative effect? So either on performance or injury? Because you were mentioning before, if you do it too much and it leads to detraining, that could be an issue.
That's like extreme. Like that's like stuff you see in like a textbook saying, if you do this, this is what could happen. But it's like in practical standpoint, it just never would happen. Yes, I do think, because I've seen this, when again when you treat a injury or a problem acutely, where you're just looking at that one structure, right? So, example, lower back. By doing the training, they can get into the proper position, right? For example, a lot of people have lower back pain because again, lower lordotic. I apologize. Yeah. And then what they ended up doing is they're getting into anterior pelvic tilt. That's causing a lot of the pain. So they're like, okay, learn to pick up your hips, get a neutral pelvis. Cool. They can do that walking. They can do that talking. They can do that with some load in some kind of hand, standing on a stability ball, whatever it may be. But all right, now let's go lift, and then they go right back to where they were. So the core training really did nothing. So that's an instance where I don't think the core training will have a positive effect if they're not able to do it throughout all their different activities that they may do.
So would that be a negative effect or just a neutral effect that doesn't transfer, in your opinion?
It's negative if we're talking performance. It's positive, or it doesn't matter if we're just trying to look at it in an acute setting of injuries. So if we're looking at it on a clinical standpoint, did we do our job? Can we check our boxes? Yes, yes, yes. But from a performance standpoint, I don't think it helps if not addressed properly.
All right, next question. Do you ever assess the core in your training programs, either objectively or subjectively?
Yeah. Can you control your pelvis? That's my core training. Can you gyrate? Can you do circles? Can you anterior, posterior tilt? Can you go in the frontal plane? Can you move? Right? If you can do that, I'm like, all right, we can work with that. That's really good. That's kind of how I judge it.
So in what kind of movements are you assessing that?
It just so these are important when we are in running. Okay. When we're at max speed, you need a little bit of posterior tilt. You got to have that control. Again, at top speed, as we're running, our hips are actually going like this, up and down, right? Like on a gimbal almost. So can they do that? When we are in our squats, front squat, back squat mostly when we see this, can you maintain a neutral pelvis and hold and bring that down under control, right? Those all become important. Can you lock it in place and hold, descend, and come back up?
So is it more throughout your coaching of the athlete and a variety of movements, you're just using your coach's eye to assess rather than a specific, we're going to test your core today and then have some measurements afterwards?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very qualitative.
Nice. So you were also mentioning before, like that minute and a half plank kind of assessment. Is that a formal assessment that you have, or is that just kind of?
That's just like if we're doing certain things, and I'm finding that their core is giving out. We'll see this at top speed mostly. When they start going at top speed, I call it the Homer Simpson gut. Boom! It just drops out, and they can't hold it anymore. I generally look at that and be like, all right, cool. Let's try this. It's just after observation. So it's never like, it's not something come in, you all have to be able to do this. Because again, there is a bit of a metabolic effect to it when you're pushing out those times.
Nice. So then do you feel